Hello, everyone. Good afternoon and welcome to RosieCon Book Festival. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Diane Rogers and I am the school librarian at Ben Davis Ninth Grade Center in Indianapolis, Indiana. And I'm the founding member of RosieCon Book Festival. I'm very pleased that you all can join us today for our festival's 7th author panel in a series of 9 panels for the 2021-2022 school year about memoirs and biographies. RosieCon chooses which books and authors to invite to our festival based upon the titles each year that are on the Elliott Rosewater, Indiana High School book list. All authors and illustrators for the 25 titles are invited to participate. For various reasons, usually scheduling conflicts, it isn't always possible for invitees to attend. In case you didn't know, the Rosewater list is a recommended reading list of contemporary titles for Indiana teens. The list is renewed and refreshed every school year with new and exciting books and is sponsored by the Indiana Library Federation. Near the end of each school year, teens from across the state vote for their favorite book and the winning title is given the Rosewater Award. Voting is online and is currently open. So go to rosiebookaward.com, that's ROSIE, bookaward.com and vote. Voting is open through the first week of May every school year. Before I give the mic and camera over to the authors and our moderator today, let me take a second to thank our sponsors of this festival. Money and support has been provided by the Lilly Endowment for the Arts, the Indianapolis Foundation Library Fund, and Wayne Township Schools. That's the school district that I work for. Without the support of these organizations, RosieCon Book Festival would not be possible, and we are in its 4th year now. Finally, enough introduction. Let's begin our panel. I want to introduce you to our moderator today. Her name is Shelby Couch. Shelby currently works as the Teen and Adult Services Librarian for the Hussey Mayfield Memorial Public Library in Zionsville, Indiana. Welcome, Shelby. It's great to have you with us. Take it away.
Thank you, Diane. It's really great to be here. I was fortunate to do a panel a few weeks ago and now getting to do this one. It's really exciting. We're going to talk today with author Sarah Saedi of Americanized, A Rebel Without a Green Card. Sarah, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
I am really excited. This book was an absolute treasure that I did not expect. When I opened it, I didn't know what I was expecting, and I got so much more out of it.
That's so nice. Thank you.
So I want to dive right in, but I will tell you that I rephrase some of my questions a little bit because there's so many good topics and things that we can explore in this book. So a lot of my questions are more having you elaborate on what was in the book. So feel free to work off the questions as best you can. My first initial question is this book, like I said, is so unique. I mean, there are things in here I wasn't even sure would be allowed to be published. It would be a lot of challenging for publishing. And I know in the book you mentioned that you originally wanted to act and you went to acting classes and that wasn't quite your thing. But at what point did you decide to write this book and what prompted you to do that? And then especially in this time period that it was written?
Yeah, I think the idea started percolating around 2015, 2016, kind of getting close to the election and realizing that immigration and illegal immigration had become a real hot button issue. And the ways that it was being discussed were very opposite to my experience. And that kind of got me thinking about telling my story. And then I was noticing more and more as an adult when I would mention to coworkers or friends that I had grown up without a green card, they were always really shocked and really surprised by that. And that was kind of the moment where I thought, oh, I guess that is a pretty unique experience. Like not a lot of people have either come across people that grew up undocumented. Like to me, it never felt like it was anything really extraordinary to go through. So when all that happened, I started feeling like, okay, maybe there's a story here to tell. And it was always this thing growing up that we didn't talk about, we didn't tell people. It was like a very shameful secret in my family. So I think it also felt therapeutic to get to talk about it. And initially I went to my book agent with the idea, and we had thought about writing it as fiction, as a young girl dealing with her family's immigration issue. And then I felt pretty strongly, actually, she had gone out and talked to some publishers and they were really looking for young adult memoirs. So when she felt like that was that was important to the marketplace. And for me, it also felt like I'd rather tell the real story. Like, I don't want a fictionalized version of this, because the point of telling the story is for people to see like a real person that has gone through it. So with all those things, it was kind of a perfect storm. And I wrote it initially as a proposal, and then we found a publisher for it.
Okay, I just find that so fascinating that they came to you and said, we're looking more for the young adult side, because it seemed like you fell into that young adult category very well with this. And I'm going to pause really quick and say that if anybody has any questions, there is a Q&A option at the bottom of your screen. Anything that you want to type in there, I can also ask Sarah. So feel free to put any questions in there that you have. Back to our conversation, Sarah. I'm really curious how you did such a good job of relating it to teens. I mean, you have a lot of references in here that were very current, even things I don't know, and I'm by no means an expert, but Bye Felicia just cracked me up. I couldn't even handle it. How did you manage that balance?
I don't know. I think that, I'm in my early 40s now, but I think that there's that 16-year-old in me is still like alive and well inside of me. And so I think that I've stayed in touch with that side of my personality. And I think having journals from my high school years really helped. I felt like going back and reading my diaries really helped access the way that I was feeling and thinking at that time. And then I love pop culture. So I try and stay very up to date. I'm sure there's, I will say I don't have, the one thing that I haven't crossed the line is I haven't gotten TikTok yet, which I know I'm like, I have to stay up to date with all these things. But I try and, for me, it's fun. It's just fun to like know what's going on with celebrity culture and pop culture. It's always been something like my brain is a sponge when it comes to those things. So I have a lot of useless pop culture knowledge, but I'm glad to hear that. I mean, sometimes you always worry when you're writing for a younger audience that you don't want to try too hard to sound like them or act like them, or, make them feel like you're trying to figure out what it's like to be young. I think that they can sort of smell the inauthenticity a mile away. But yeah, sometimes I feel like the harder you try, the worse it's going to be. So I just try to really write it as myself, and hope that young people would receive it and would enjoy reading it.
I felt like it flowed together really well, even for young adults now, and even before, while you were doing it, I was straddling my timeline. So some of the things were a little before me and some were a little after me. And I was trying to keep up with the references, and I was really excited when I knew what they were. And I think even some were prevalent today that kids would have heard of or teens would know. So I was really excited by that. For me, you blended that humor with the pop culture references and all of those memes and things like that in the language, but then you blended the humor with this offset of such a raw story. I mean, you put a lot of things in there that are very open. Can you tell me more about that?
Yeah, I don't know. I find that no pun intended, but I am a kind of open book person. Sometimes I feel like my problem is that I overshare and I tell too much, that I should keep things more private. So that's never been an issue for me in terms of there wasn't anything in the book that I felt like on the fence about putting in there. But yeah, I think that humor for me that's sort of the natural way that I like to write. But I always say like one of my favorite genres is comedy with goosebumps, which is, things that are funny, but will hit you with emotion kind of out of nowhere almost. So I felt like with the book, it was really important to keep it light and keep it entertaining, but then to also really delve into the hardships of growing up undocumented and what that really looked like for my family, and to not make it feel like it was just a comedy of errors. But I always say too, I think because we did eventually get green cards and that we did eventually become American citizens, it was a lot easier to look back on our experience through the lens of humor. I think that it helps that our story did have a happy ending. But yeah, I think it's always important to be able to, too much tragedy is really hard for people to bear, and too much humor and comedy can then feel a bit superficial. So I think it's really important to be able to strike a balance between the two.
Well, I will say, I think you did a very good job, because this is not something, now I am by no means the leading expert on all things teen books, but I've been doing it for a few years now. And this isn't something I've quite read before. This is really raw and honest, and it gives an accurate account of what being a teenager was like. Some of these things even I identified with from my time as a teenager. And I think especially in the time we're in now, about a lot of controversy about what are we exposing our teens to, like this was really a bit refreshing,
Oh,
and open and honest.
yeah, I think the best compliment that I've received from younger readers, especially young people that don't like to read or don't read that often, was that this didn't feel like work. Reading your book, it felt easy. It didn't feel like homework. And so that to me is the greatest compliment as a writer. And then I think to your point too, it did, even though it's a young adult memoir, I think a lot of people in my generation really enjoyed it because of the nostalgia factor to it, like people that grew up in the 90s. And then I'll also add that when I was a teenager in the 90s, we were obsessed with the 70s. Like we were obsessed with like the music from that decade, the fashion of that decade. So I do wonder, I'm like, maybe teens today or teens a few years ago maybe have that same reverence for the 90s, because it's the same amount of time back as when we were in high school. But yeah, I think the nostalgia factor was really big for adult readers as well.
I would agree with all that. Going back to the kids coming back to the 90s and things like that. It was great. It made my heart happy. I'll tell you that.
That's good. I'm glad.
It kind of, for me, this book was really, and I think for a lot of readers, that it wasn't just a book. When I first read the title, I really thought you were going to focus more on what it was like to be from another country, and how you felt, how you tried to battle daily with like what America looked like and all the changes. But really, your book started out that way, but then it came into this sense of identity.
Mhm.
And like I said, I felt like a lot of things you went through, even though the minute details of you being from another country, yes, those are different and those are yours. In a lot of ways, I could identify with a lot of those things. Like I have an older sister who I have a lot of those, that big bond with. Do you feel like this helped you with your identity and how people see their identities?
I think so, definitely. I think the watershed moment that I had when I was writing it and working on it was how kind of fascinating it was that the part of my identity that I felt insecure about or that I was ashamed of has opened so many doors for me as an adult, and that it really like manifested into this book. So that was really liberating to think like all those things, it is, I don't want it to sound like a cliche in terms of it gets better, but it's like all those things that I was really grappling with as a teen really became a sort of a superpower as an adult. And then I think our immigration story, I think, is unique and it is interesting, but I didn't want the book to be entirely about that because it wouldn't have been, I personally don't think it would have been as interesting. And I think that what really like most readers connect to is that no matter who you are or what your background is, you're still dealing with a lot of that teen angst and insecurity and just trying to figure out who you are and what you want out of life. And so we, with the help of my editor, it was really strategic on our part to have the immigration stuff in, but to also have it interspersed with normal teen obstacles like, that high school crush that doesn't like you back, or dealing with acne, or dealing with sibling rivalries and relationships, or conflict with your parents. So it was really important to us that the book, even though it had a really specific point of view, still felt really relatable to a wider audience.
Okay. I was impressed with that level of balance for identity. I felt like almost I could tell from you writing it that you had discovered things about yourself from what you wrote.
Yeah, I mean, the scariest thing I will say that I discovered about myself is going back and reading my diaries, realizing, oh, wow, there are things that I was insecure about as a 15 or 16-year-old that as a woman in my, at the time, late 30s, I was still insecure about. Like, that was really hard. I'm like, there's been a lot of evolution, don't get me wrong, but there's been a lot of things that I'm like, oh, it's been 20 years and I still have a hard time with that, or I still feel insecure about these things. So that was pretty eye-opening. But I think at the same time, one of the frustrations of going back and reading my diaries is that I actually didn't write about not having a green card very often. Like, I think I referenced it a couple times. And I kept looking for some meaty, poignant thing in my diaries that I could include in the book for my 16-year-old self about growing up without a green card. And it just, my main concerns, I mean, it was a huge deal growing up, but my main concerns were still like my fights with my friends, or, that wanting to get a date to prom, like things like that. Those were the things that came up over and over again in my journals.
Well, that's actually a question I had for you, because in the initial part of the book, in the introduction, you referenced, like, if I got deported, if I went back, I can barely speak Farsi. How would I survive in Iran at that time? And then at the end of the book, you wrote sort of a letter to yourself, like almost lamenting that person. Like, if I'd had to go back, who would I have been? What would my choices have looked like? And I think we all do that to a degree, but yours was so interesting because at first I felt like it caused you so much anxiety from that first initial. And then as you grew and realized, like, maybe this wouldn't have been the worst thing that could have ever happened to me.
Yeah, I mean, I think that no matter who you are, where you're from, there's places in your life where you've been at a crossroads, whether it's, the college you decide to go to, or, the town your family moves to, that you can sort of wonder about all those different people you could have become. And yeah, obviously for my family, I have often thought about what would our lives look like if we had stayed in Iran. I would have a completely different life today than I did coming to America. So yeah, that was a really fun exercise, doing the letter to my Iranian self, the girl who never left, because it is really interesting to think about. Who would I be? I would be married to a different person. I wouldn't have the kids that I have. It would be an entirely different life. And I think as a kid, I had a lot of connection to my Iranian culture, and my parents were pretty good about having us speak Farsi at home and everything like that. But I definitely felt more American, I would say, as a teenager. And now as an adult, I feel like there's more things about where I'm from and my Iranian culture that I'm holding on to tighter than I was as a teen. And I think that's also really interesting how that happens, where you kind of reject where you're from. And then when you grow up, you're like, oh, I just want to embrace it as tightly as possible because now I'm raising kids and I want to be able to pass on some of what I grew up with to them.
See, I thought that was a unique part of your book too, because at some point when I thought about the way you phrased, or you're referencing Americanized, there were a lot of things you were doing that were very typical American things. But then there were some points where you would bring things up where you really were holding on to your culture. And now make sure I'm saying this right, but you were only in Iran for the first couple of years of your life. By the age of 2, you had left. Mm-hmm. And you hadn't gone back, and for that was 24 years that you were waiting for your green card.
Yeah.
So you were really, there were certain things about, like, well, everyone knows that Iranians are about this way about weddings or marriages, or about how the plastic surgery, and there were things that you inherently knew as your culture and that you stuck with.
Right. Yeah, that's true. I mean, I think that when you grow up in a household of my parents, my dad was in his early 30s and my mom was in her late 20s when they came to America. My dad had gone to college here, so they had spent time in the States, but they were fully formed adults when they came here. So I think growing up in that whole household and growing up with a very large extended family of Iranian aunts and uncles and cousins, our social circle, like I had my friends in high school, but our social circle outside of my friend circle was all my Iranian family members. So I think that really helped keep me connected to my culture. And I think that's really the immigrant mentality too, which I can really appreciate, is that even though we're not living in our, homeland, our home country, we're going to make sure that we stick together in America. And that was really a philosophy that my family had. We were very lucky that most of us ended up in the Bay Area in California. And so there was really this strong sentiment of family is the most important thing, and we're all we have, and we all came here together, and we have to stick together. So I think that helped me really have a connection to being Iranian that I don't know that I would have had if it was just my family of 5 and no extended family around us.
You had quite a few aunts and uncles and family and cousins, and I have the Farsi names here of like Dei or Maman, but I don't want to mispronounce anything. but it seems like your family held such a large, like even when you didn't think they were, it felt like they had such influences on you.
Yeah, definitely. Especially my cousins. I was very lucky in that I'm close to both my siblings. I have an older sister and a younger brother, but we grew up with so many cousins. Most of them were older than me. They were very influential, and they really felt like siblings. I feel like we were as close as brothers and sisters. And we still have family reunions where, at the time, I think I say in the book that the idea of family reunion felt odd to me because we were always together. There was no need to reunite. But now, as we've all gotten older and moved to different parts of the country, we just a few months ago, my uncle got us all together in the Bay Area. We rented a house for a few days. And so I feel like we've still maintained those bonds over the years. But yeah, I'm very lucky. I feel very lucky that I came from this big immigrant family.
And now that was your uncle Daim Mirzad, right?
They're done. Yeah, that's right.
Did I say that correctly? Oh, thank goodness. Okay, yay.
Means uncle in Farsi. Yeah, and his name's Mehrdad. That's right.
Oh, that's great, because I was a little worried I was gonna say that wrong. One of the things that I don't think I've ever considered until I read this in your book was I've always heard the terms illegal aliens or undocumented immigrants. But you took that to the next level and you said, so we're dealing with like illegal immigrants, so you're an immigrant, but then it's also the idea of it's a foreign concept, you're a foreign place, you are foreign. But then you also said, well, my law-abiding human friends, like you felt like a true alien to the idea of you were here and there was nowhere you could go where you weren't committing a crime for
Right.
existing.
Yeah, I mean, illegal alien just sounded so weird to me as a teenager. I mean, it still does. I think it's not really in the vernacular anymore, which is good, but it just didn't it felt so other, you know what I mean? Like I don't know why that word ever really, like why that terminology had to be used, but I felt like, yeah, it was like an extra othered basically. And I poke fun at it a little bit, and we actually went back and forth about whether I should even include it in the book. And I felt like even though the language has changed, that was the language of the time. And I think it's really important to reference that and to remember that that's what we were called. And that's kind of the way that I thought of us. And even like if we want to get into super technical terms, my family entered the country on a visitor's visa. And then we overstayed our visa and tried to get a political asylum, which didn't work out. But technically, what I've been told is like, that's not even considered necessarily undocumented, because you did enter the country legally, you just stayed. But I had family members that did it other ways too. And I think with everything that was going on in Iran, we would have tried to come here no matter what. There was just no, or we would have at least tried to go somewhere. There was no future for us in Iran with the direction the country was headed in. Yeah, but it's still weird to think of like even illegal. I don't know. I think undocumented is really the better term. But I just like to think of us as like people who do make this country better and are just trying to seek a better life.
Well, and I think you address a lot of misconceptions of what is it considered to be an illegal alien or undocumented or even the term immigrant. You were just like everybody else, but these fears that you had, I mean, like you couldn't go on a trip to Mexico with a friend. That's not something that I would have ever considered being an issue.
Right. Yeah, there was a lot of things. Like just recently, I actually saw somebody tweeted about how the best thing that you could ever do when you're in college is study abroad, if that's something that you can do, like how formative that was for them and how amazing of an experience it was. And I still felt that pang of, oh, I wasn't able to do that because I didn't have a green card. And that was something that I did. I did see friends like getting to study in Paris for a semester, things like that. And, it's smaller sacrifices, but it does make you feel, you feel the pain of that still this many years later. I still felt that like, oh, well, I didn't get to do that. I wasn't able to do that. But yeah, one of the main reasons I wrote the book was because I wanted people to understand how hard it actually is to become a citizen. That it's not just you come and you fill out a form and you do things the right way. That it's just a lot more complicated than that. It's a lot more expensive than people realize. It takes a lot longer than people realize, just the waiting period of trying to to become a permanent resident. So that was really important to me, was to make sure people understood how the process actually works. And then for people to see that, yeah, people that deal with this are, they're your next door neighbor. They're the people at your high school. That we have the sort of idea of what it means to be illegal or undocumented, and that's not necessarily the case for everybody.
Well, and I believe if I read correctly, your family spent quite a bit of money on lawyers and going places that, you had to take days out of school to go do these things. I mean, if somebody didn't have that kind of financial support or way to support themselves, they almost couldn't even achieve it as a goal.
The legal fees itself are so expensive. And my family, I mean, we were lucky. I would say we were middle class, but my parents definitely had, they were small business owners. They did pay taxes. That's another big misconception. And so it was a major financial strain on our family, especially because once we were going to college, they weren't able to apply for financial aid because we didn't have green cards. So they had to pay our tuition in full. But yeah, just the lawyer's fees, the costs of an application to get a green card to become a citizen are really significant costs. And I don't think people really are aware of that.
I know just from the things you mentioned, like they didn't have disposable income, but they did their best and they paid for your schooling and things like that. But that's a lot of money to have to commit to something that most other people don't have to do. And I'm sure there's a large percentage of people who are undocumented that probably couldn't even begin to afford to do something like that to get their green card.
Exactly. It's like, where do you even start? And I think too, it was important for me to get across just the idea that when we left Iran, it really felt like there were no other options. So I think that that's also something that's important for people to remember, is that usually the reason people are leaving, the stakes are very high. It is sort of a life and death kind of a decision. And I think anybody, as a mom of 2 young kids now, like in a heartbeat, if I had to leave this country because it was a life or death thing, but I didn't know where I was going to go or what I was going to do once I got there, I would still go. So I think it's really important to have a little bit of empathy.
And if I had to guess, I'm sure there are plenty of teens around that do experience something similar to what you did, whether different countries, things like that. And you address that in your book. You say, if you're undocumented, here's some things you can do, or here's some advice for you. Do you have advice for teens or even adults that aren't from another country, that have lived here our whole lives, how we can be more sensitive to that, or how we can help that, or even acknowledging that in our day-to-day lives?
Yeah, I think in just the terminology that we use, I think that is really important. I think just keeping an open mind to other cultures and other points of views. I think educating ourselves too, in terms of the ways immigration actually does really help this country. I know that for a lot of people, it always comes down to this notion that, oh, they're taking our jobs, and the statistics that is just not the case. And I also always like to point out that I don't see people having as much ire and frustration over automation and how automation takes a lot of jobs away, whether it's when you go to the grocery store, do you stand in that self-service checkout line, or do you use the ATM, or do you go to the bank and talk to a teller? Like, there's so many places in our lives where we're choosing to deal with machines instead of people. And that, it's the same idea. It's like, well, if we're upset about if it's really truly the job thing that's making people upset, then maybe we should have a bigger conversation about other jobs that are being taken away by computers. So I do feel like it's just, having an open mind, understanding people's struggles. Really, I try and remember, you really truly don't know what anyone's going through behind closed doors. But yeah, I think there's just this sort of fear and anxiety over the unknown. And I think that that's why books are so important. These kinds of stories are so important, because I think it does give readers a window into a perspective or a culture or a life that they wouldn't have a window into otherwise.
Well, I feel like you've really tapped into something that maybe isn't talked about or addressed at all, even in a day and time now where I think we're addressing some of those harder issues. This isn't something that I had quite considered, or I think that I've heard a lot about. When I was reading a portion of your book, and I can't remember which portion it was, but you were talking about film screening and things. And I thought, well, I've never seen an action movie where a person was undocumented and they accidentally were in the wrong place for a crime, and then they're supposed to get deported and they're on the run from deportation. The only time I've ever even thought about deportation in books or heard about it is Nicola Yoon in her book The Sun Is Also a Star, and I that occurred to me as I was reading this one.
Yeah, I've also noticed a trend, and there was a period of time where I was working on developing Americanized as a TV show, and unfortunately, it didn't end up getting a green light. But it was told through the perspective of who the young girl that would have been based on me, and the first episode was the discovery that she's just like it happens in my book, because I didn't know until I was about 13 years old that I didn't have a green card. So it was her making this discovery about her family, but obviously my parents knew and my sister did know. But I have noticed a trend when it comes to stories about characters that are undocumented in film and TV. There's always this tendency to want them to somehow not know that they were undocumented, that it's a discovery that they're making. And I think that the thinking behind that, whether it's coming from the creators or from the network, is that, oh, the audience won't like them if they are undocumented and they knew they were undocumented the whole time. Like, we can sort of can have our cake and eat it too. We can tell this story about the struggles of being undocumented, but we can still have the audience root for this character because they didn't know they were undocumented. Like, they didn't know they were doing anything wrong. And I think what I say to that is, like, they could still know and be a good person. The two don't have to be mutually exclusive. So I think it's important to tell these stories, but not have to make it like this person had no idea this whole time that they were living in the United States undocumented, which I think as a young person, if you're a kid, I think that's realistic. But as an adult, I think at a certain point, you're going to know.
Exactly. And sometimes there's no choice in that matter either. Like you said, your family didn't have a lot of choice but to leave.
Yeah.
So coming here and letting it expire, that there's only so many options that you can do to keep your family safe and be somewhere safe.
Exactly. And I think, this kind of goes a little bit against my book, but I also think that an interesting statistic that I came across was that, I can't remember the actual percentage, but the percentage of stories about immigrants in film and TV about undocumented immigrants is way larger than the actual amount of the percentage of immigrants that are undocumented. So we're also telling more stories about, like, there are other immigrant stories, I think, that need to be told as well. I think this is obviously a really important subject and a very hot button issue. And I think it's really important to work on clearing away some of those misconceptions. But I also think that it is true that there's a plethora of immigration stories out there. And everybody, it's not a monolith. People have varying experiences and come from different backgrounds. And I think it's important that we tell all those stories, that we don't also tell everything through a filter of, like, every immigrant lives here and is undocumented, isn't a citizen, or isn't a permanent resident, because that's not actually the case either.
Well, there were several ways that you could go about getting your green card too. Some were far more difficult than others.
Yeah.
And you mentioned, I think it was President Obama who had let so many, or not President Obama, but a previous president who had, in like 1982, I think, who had 15,000 immigrants got their green card, but you guys had missed that.
Yeah, a lot of people don't know that actually it was Ronald Reagan who gave asylum to, I don't know off the top of my head the number of immigrants at the time, but it's kind of surprising. He was a Republican. Like, I think I don't know that would happen today. That's probably, like, yeah, we probably assume that it would be a Democrat that would make that kind of policy decision. But that was, that helped a vast number of immigrants become permanent residents of this country and to eventually get citizenship. So yeah, way to go, Reagan.
Yeah, you referenced a lot of presidents and political things that had happened, and even things that were happening in Iran. So you still vote and are active in what's happening in Iran politics.
Yeah, I did vote in an election in 2009, which was the election that led to the Green Movement in Iran. And I have to say, I have mixed feelings about that now. I don't know if I would do it again, only because as much as I support the Iranian people, there is also that part of me that feels like I don't live there. I haven't lived there since I was 2 years old. I don't know that it's really fair for me to have a voice or a say, in what happens in Iran. Um, but yeah, I technically, I still have my Iranian passport. I'd love to go visit. That's a dream of mine, but I also know that it could be a little bit complicated considering some of the things that I've disclosed in my book. So I don't know if that would ever be a good idea. But yeah, that election was probably rigged anyway. So I don't think that I think it was more of a symbolic gesture than anything. But yeah, it is hard to say. It's like you have a connection to where you're from, but at the end of the day, I think I have to realize, like, I've lived in the United States for 39 years and I lived in Iran for 2 years. And as much as I feel such a connection to, when it's the World Cup, I have to say, like, I'm rooting for Iran. So I definitely have that. I wouldn't even, nostalgia is not even the right word because I don't remember living there. I have such
You care.
country. Yeah, but
You care deeply.
yeah, but I think it's really important for those of us that have grown up outside of Iran to realize, like, I can't really say, like, what people need in Iran because I don't know what it's like to live there day to day.
Well, I have a question about part of that, but also you mentioned earlier that there are probably other cultures and countries with immigrants that have these same stories. And as I was reading your book, I have a bookmark and I can show it to you. I'm a fan of Malala Yousafzai.
Oh, wow, that's beautiful.
I just love her story. I love everything about her. And I try to impart life lessons to my niece, who's 11, through Malala Yousafzai. And this quote on my bookmark says that one child, one teacher, one book, and a pen can change the world. And I wonder if you have experienced where you've had people tell you they feel like this book helped like you helped them change, or you helped bring about something that is causing change. Because I think that in the same ways that other people are standing up for their countries and their homes, that you did kind of open up a door that wasn't there before.
Yeah, I mean, I think I've definitely heard from readers who've said, I had no idea, like, I had no idea that it was this complicated to immigrate to this country. So that's always been really nice to know that people are seeing things from a different perspective. I've gotten emails from readers that are undocumented and that they feel like my story gave them hope because there was a light at the end of the tunnel for me. And I think of everybody I hear from, I think that's always the most meaningful to me, is that if I could help somebody or comfort somebody that's going through the same thing that my family was. But and then I have gotten a couple, like, very few, I have to say, but I did get an email from a teacher once who was teaching the book in her classroom, and there was a parent that was really up in arms about it and ended up the kid ended up getting moved to a different class. So, and she asked me to write an email to the parent explaining that this wasn't propaganda about illegal immigration. And I did take the time to do that. And then I thought, this is silly. Like, this is taking, like, my time. Not only is it taking the 30 minutes it takes to write that email, but it's it's ruining my day. It's taking up a lot of my mental capacity. And I don't think that I'm unfortunately going to change this person's mind anyway, nor should I spend a lot of my time trying to. Like, I think the book speaks for itself. And if they want to make judgments on it without reading it, like, that's their choice. I can't really do anything about it. But I would encourage people to read it, even if they think that they have certain points of view about immigration that can't, because I'm not necessarily trying to change anyone's views either. I just want to explain my story and give people a little bit more perspective, perhaps.
Well, you're shedding light on something that I think has a lot of preconceived notions.
Yes.
That maybe not everyone has researched or knows much about. I mean, I learned quite a few things in here that I had no knowledge about beforehand.
Right. I think what's really scary too with what we're seeing with, this resurgence of banned books is that we don't want to educate ourselves because we're afraid of having empathy for other people. I think that's a big part of it, is like, I don't want to read it because I am afraid that if I read it, then I will have, an emotion for what you're going through. And that makes me uncomfortable, and I don't want to have that. So I'd rather just be completely ignorant. And I think that that's really a shame, because reading books, I do, like we say, windows and mirrors. Like, I do think it helps us see ourselves, and it helps us see what other people deal with and struggle with. And yeah, do feel the sense that the reason books are being banned is because we don't want our young people to have that sort of empathy for views that we don't agree with.
It can be really scary, especially for things that we don't expect that to happen for, or how many people and teens or young children that it's really affecting. And that's why I was, like I said, I found your book really refreshing, because there's things in here that I don't know would fly in some of the places that I've been or that I've worked at, or anything that even people, like things that I've experienced. And I'm curious if you had any problems getting this published for some of the things you've put in here. Not that I don't think they were wrong or bad in any way. They're your experiences, but it was really mind-blowing to me.
Yeah, no, I was very lucky. My editor was a woman named Kelly Delaney, and she was really supportive throughout the entire process. And there was a couple F words that she asked me to take out. Like, I do have a bit of a potty mouth, so there were some times where she's like, I think like it's okay to have like one or two, but let's change this one. So there are certain moments like that. And then the other things that we took out were times where she was sort of like, if you wanted to write a book about dating, maybe we could include this, but this feels like it's too much of a tangent from the main story that we're telling. But there wasn't really anything. I was actually surprised too. Like, there are some drug and sexual references that I didn't know would be okay for younger readers. And I don't think that there was never a conversation about taking them out, because I do feel like the book showed the consequences that I dealt with in the aftermath of some of those decisions. And that my parents had kind of a strange, unique philosophy on those things. So I think it was worth including, because I think it was a unique point of view. But I will say, like, I'm so thrilled that the book is being taught in high schools. And I think, we can't talk down to teenagers. Like, the things that I write about in my book, like, might feel shocking to a parent that's reading it, but these are things that kids are like dealing with in their day-to-day life. And I think if we pretend that they're not, then we're doing ourselves a disservice too. But yeah, I mean, what were the things that you thought? I'm curious, like, what were the elements of it? Was it immigration stuff, or just more of the other parts of
Oh,
it?
just the regular teen things, such as the sexual and the drug references.
Yeah.
They don't in any way bother me, and I love that they're in there. I think our teens do experience those things, and learning that, yeah, this is what I dealt with afterward. They don't always get that perspective, so it was just a little mind blowing to me, because of some of the things that are going on right now in our climate, and even some of the things that I've dealt with in the last decade or so of being in the teen
Right.
scene.
Sure. I would think too. Yeah, some of those with those parents, I'm like, you probably should be more concerned about some of the other things that are in the book than the immigration stuff. The immigration stuff is probably like the most like benign stuff in there. But and I mean, this is all anecdotal, but I do think I had one teacher at some point ask if they could get a copy of the book with a couple chapters taken out, and that just wasn't something that we were able to do for them. So I understand like the sensitivity around certain things in the book, but I do feel like I don't glorify anything, and I'm just pretty honest about my experiences. And I was, I mean, Rebel Without a Green Card is actually pretty tongue-in-cheek, because I was a pretty like straight-laced kid for the most part. And I think that is being a child of immigrants and not wanting to get in trouble and not wanting to disappoint them and let them down. So I wasn't very rebellious. I think that's sort of the joke of the title, is that once you read the book, you see that I was kind of a prude, to tell you the truth.
Well, the immigrant child guilt complex you mentioned, like, it kept you from doing, like, there were times I really thought you were going to make one choice and you're like, no, I can't do that to my parents.
Yeah. In fact, I would say my sister was definitely more the rebel without a green card, because she did a lot of crazy rebellious things. And the chapter about my sister was initially called Rebel Without a Green Card. And they were like, oh, we like that so much, let's have that be the, part of the title of the book. But she was definitely, of us three kids, she was the more rebellious one. She broke our parents in for us.
Well, I will say I certainly appreciate how open and honest this book is for those reasons, because as we're talking about a lot of things that are going on right now with book banning and everything, the thing that has stuck with me most is that when we say like, oh, this book is banned, a lot of them are people's personal experiences. And so it's almost like saying, well, this person's experience doesn't matter or shouldn't be taught or shouldn't exist.
Right.
Or we don't want to acknowledge it. And that's so, irregardless of the things you're talking about in here, this is your experience, and no one can say your experience doesn't matter.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think too, it's like we have to be, I think it's an important issue across both political aisles too. I think that there's there's things happening on the more progressive left too, where I think like, we can't shield kids from certain things that were written in books a long time ago either. Like, I do think that the worst thing that we can do is in trying to raise a generation of tolerant kids is by raising them to be intolerant to any uncomfortable feelings. So I think, yeah, we could be shooting ourselves in the foot a bit. And I think also we're not giving teenagers enough credit. I think that they, with the help of their like incredible educators that are out there, can read a text and decide how they feel about it and how they think about it. It's not going to be, we're not indoctrinating these kids.
Our teens, they experience and feel and see and critically think about a lot more things than I think a lot of us give them credit for. Even sometimes I have to remind myself of that. So I would agree with that. And so I appreciate your book for offering that platform to do so.
So thank you so much.
Well, I know we're getting a little bit shorter on the time end, Sarah, and I really was curious. So I did not get a chance to read your other books, unfortunately. But from what they seem like fantasy books, and I even saw that you have a new book called "I Miss You, I Hate You" coming up. That's about the pandemic.
Yeah.
Can you tell me a little more about your other books too?
Yeah. So I had two books that came out before Americanized, which is a series called Never Ever, and the second book is called The Lost Kids, and it's sort of my spin on Peter Pan, and that I just felt like there's probably a darker version of that story to be told. So those were sort of a Peter Pan retelling. And then the book that's coming out in October 2022, you can pre-order it now, is actually called I Miss You, I Hate This. And it's about two best friends dealing with, in the book, it's a fictional pandemic. It's not exactly like the one that we're going through, and the isolation and the separation of that. But sort of like how Americanized is a book about immigration, but it's also a book about growing up as an awkward, insecure teenager. This is a book that's sort of about the pandemic, but it's also really about the ups and downs of adolescence and friendship. And I really, truly, like when the pandemic first hit, I had so much empathy for seniors that were going to be missing graduation and prom and all those things that they were looking forward to for 4 years. So I wanted to encapsulate that experience and those feelings in a book.
So it's not based on our exact pandemic, but similar themes and topics.
Yeah, and this pandemic, I think, obviously for reasons of raising the stakes for the characters, was in my book is a pandemic that impacts younger people more. Like with COVID, we saw that obviously older people and immunocompromised people were the most at risk. In this version of the book, it's actually teenagers that are getting more sick from the virus that's in the book. And I think that was just more selfishly a way as a writer to raise the stakes for the characters. But it's not dystopian, and it doesn't feel like science fiction or anything like that. It's really, truly the story about two best friends and how they grow apart and come together and grow apart again.
I look forward to reading it because even though we've gotten a few things coming to the library that are pandemic related, or even to those qualities of what the pandemic has caused, I think people are finally starting to take a breath and realize that we've gone through a lot more than we think we have in 2+ years.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I have some concerns too. Just even in writing it, I felt a little bit like, oh, I don't want to be writing about the pandemic. I'm living in a pandemic. But I do hope for anybody that might think, oh, I don't want to read a book about the pandemic, I'm so sick of it, that it's actually, this would be cathartic, that it's more of like kind of reflecting on everything that we've gone through, and seeing it in narrative form like that, I think is also just captures like how crazy it really was, like what we were dealing with, and especially those early months of just being stuck inside our houses. So I hope for anybody who reads it that it feels more of a cathartic experience.
Well, I'm really excited for it. I always love something new and different, and I love your writing style, so I'm excited for that book. And I'm curious, Sarah. So I have met some other authors in the past that said, like, I love my book the way it is, but knowing that, that times have changed, they're like, I don't know if I would write the same book now. I know your book isn't quite, it's only a couple of years older, but do you think that since your book was written that there's things now that you would change or add, or that maybe would be different because of the times and how crazy the world's been since then?
I mean, yeah, I think that there's not a whole lot in the book in terms of what we saw the last few years with family separation. And I think that seeing how ugly and scary things got, I wish that there was a little bit more of a reference to that in the book, because like you mentioned, the book is told with a lot of humor. And so I don't want anyone to read it and feel like, oh God, like this is, why is she writing something funny when like we've seen how horrific things have gotten. But the book came out really like before all of that happened. So I think more of a discussion about that would have been helpful. And then no, but I have to say, like, I haven't read it in a really, really long time. So maybe I would think, oh, I wish I had taken the story out or put the story in. But I'm pretty happy with everything that was included in it.
Okay, I just wondered because things have changed and everybody feels differently. And since your story was your story, it's a little bit different than some of the authors and the books that they've written that I've met too. So
For sure. Like I if there could be future editions of it, then I definitely would want to write, just an update in terms of like where we are politically and things that have happened in the last few years. That would be great.
and have you met, since writing this book, have you met other people that maybe were immigrants from other countries or had similar experiences that have reached out to you or anything?
I haven't necessarily met people in person directly, but I've definitely like met people online. One person in particular came across my book after he was undocumented, and he was also kicked out of his house when he came out to his parents, and he read my book while he was in a shelter, in a homeless shelter. And that was just like, it was so profound to hear that when he was going through like one of the worst periods of his life, that something that I wrote could have helped him or given him some solace or comfort. And then we sort of continued an email exchange, and he's turns out is a beautiful writer and is a really incredible story to share as well, with with a very different perspective than my own. So I think that it would be great I'd love to do like an anthology book someday too, of stories about younger immigrants or children of immigrants, because I think depending on, your upbringing, where you live in the United States and where you came from, like we all have very different stories to tell.
I think that'd be a worthwhile book to read because everybody's experience has to be vastly different, but at the core, still the same feelings and ideas and things like that.
Yeah, especially even like even Iranians who left Iran but didn't come to America, that ended up in other countries. I think their immigration experiences are vastly different than my own.
And Sarah, since reading your book, can you give me and maybe people who are watching some idea of what current Iranian culture looks like? I think we've been very desensitized by the TV shows we watch and the books we've read and the things and the movies we see. I had a preconceived notion of what I thought it was like over there, and then I read your book and I thought, well, I don't know anything.
Yeah, I would say like the biggest misconceptions I think people still have about Iran is like even visually the way that people picture it as sort of like desert landscape and camels and the sort of very like old school idea of what the Middle East is like. And Tehran, which is the capital of Iran, where I was born, is like a thriving city. Like I lived in New York City for a few years, and when my parents came to visit, they're like, oh, this reminds us so much of Iran. So I think that even like, Iranians love to share photographs of Tehran today, because I think that people don't understand like it's skyscrapers and subways and that it's a big city. So I think just even the look of the country, I mean, obviously there's different pockets of Iran, but that people tend to not realize that, it's a pretty like, in terms of the way the civilization is, like, it's very contemporary. And then I think too, just what I've heard in pictures I've seen too, that's really interesting is like we do tend to think of women completely covered up in the Middle East. And I know in Iran, like fashion and style is very important to a lot of Iranians. So you will see like headscarves, but with a lot of hair showing and a lot of makeup and a lot of like really expensive labels that people are wearing. And obviously that's a subset of the community of Tehran, but I think that those are things that people don't really think about in America, that there are a lot of things that, whether it's Western culture or not, that is just not necessarily the way people picture Iran in their heads. And then I mentioned in the book, but when my parents grew up there, it felt like a very European country in a lot of ways. Like when my parents lived there, my mom, wore mini skirts and it was very, very much more Western than it is today.
So it was, I know you mentioned there, like, this is not Aladdin. This is the, take that notion and throw it away.
Yeah, it's not. And I mean, that's part of the reason that I would love to go visit someday, is because I've seen the photos and I've heard the stories, but I think it's a totally different thing to actually get to experience it. Or I love getting to watch shows where people got that episode of Anthony Bourdain's show where he goes to Iran is so special. Because for people like me, that's the closest I might ever get to going there myself. So it's very meaningful.
Well, Sarah, I just want to say thank you so much for that. I want to also say thank you for educating me on how to pronounce Iran. Clearly, Iran is just what I've heard all my life, so that's what I went with, and so I've been trying this whole time to challenge my notion of how I say everything.
Well, thank you for reading it, and thank you for all of your incredibly thoughtful questions. This was such a nice conversation. I'm so grateful.
Thank you.
That was an absolutely fantastic panel. So thank you both, Shelby and Zara. Thank you so much for participating today. Audience, thank you for your time and attention today. We want you to encourage you to make sure that you vote for your favorite Rosewater book. Remember that RosieBookAward.com voting is currently open, and it is mostly digital. You could speak to your school librarian, though, in case that digital option is not available for you. There are old-fashioned paper ballot options as well. If you do choose to vote digitally, it is at RosieBookAward.com. That's ROSIE bookaward.com. Please remember, everyone in the audience, that today is just one of 9 author panels for this school year. We also have the authors in those books and panels from previous school years available on our RosieCon YouTube channel. So just Google search the RosieCon Book Festival and you can see those, and you can use them, teachers and educators and librarians, in your classrooms if you choose. Students and anyone else in the audience, you can freely watch those yourself. Our next panel is going to be on March 3rd. It's going to feature Minnie McGinnis and her book Heroine. So that is a play on words. There is a heroine, a female hero in the story, and the book is also, unfortunately, about drug use and how it goes very wrong. So educators, please don't forget that you can access today's session and previous session via the YouTube site. Videos can be used in classrooms, and they are absolutely free to use, and you can use them at your schedule and as many times as you wish. Everyone, stay safe. Have a good rest of your day. If you're here in Indiana, we're dealing with a lot of rain. So stay dry, everyone, and have a good rest of your day. Thank you so much for joining us. Bye-bye.
Bye.